there's a couple problems with Pyke as a mid laner. One of the biggest ones is that Pyke's mid lane, whenever anybody perceived it to be viable, was incredibly high win rate. Like, it's one thing if Pyke was like a 50% win rate mid laner. That has almost never been the case in his entire history as a mid. Whenever Pyke is played mid, his win rate in mid is one of the highest in the entire game. And so we'll start with that, is that when we saw Pyke mid, it was never like, oh, Pyke's 50% mid, we have to get rid of him. No, it was like, Pyke has the highest win rate in the game as a mid laner. And then on top of that, Pyke's support in these situations would always be lower than 50%. He'd be like 48%, 49%. And so we had this issue where we'd have a character who was in a lane with a very, very, very high win rate, and then his primary role would have a very low win rate. And it would make a situation where we could never buff support Pyke, even when it was weak, because of mid lane Pyke, basically. And then on top of this, even when mid lane Pyke had these incredibly, incredibly high win rates, very, very few people played him. And so I was just talking about, like, there needs to be a player desire in a role to really be worth supporting it. And another issue we had with mid lane Pyke is, even when he was winning tons of his games, very few people seemed to be interested in playing it. And so we had actually a very similar to SERAPHINE problem, where we had one role, very high win rate, incredibly low play rate, and another role, which is the main role, where the majority of people are playing it, but we can't buff it because of the role very few people are playing. And so that's why we tended to like work on and go after Pyke mid, is because we wanted to create a situation where we could balance Pyke support. And to do that, Pyke mid needed to get weaker. But one of the problems is that Pyke mid getting weaker, it was already an underplayed character, and so when you take a character who's underplayed at 54 and you bring them to 51, that looks like the character disappears. A secondary issue with Pyke mid is the way it won the game was kind of messed up. And I'll get into it like this, in that one of the things we think is very important in League of Legends is the laning phase. We generally believe that it's very important that if you're winning games of League of Legends, one of the ways you're doing it as a solo laner or a jungler is by getting some amount of CS. If the way you win the game is not CSing, that's okay if you're a support, right? We kind of balance supports around that. But if the way you're winning the game is not CSing, that's generally something that we think creates pretty negative patterns. And so whenever we see a character who's winning the game in a solo lane or the jungle, and through not interacting with the minion wave ever, that potentially is a problem. And so characters like this in the past have been a lot of mid lane supports. Surprise, surprise, Pyke is one of them, but there's also Sona mid, Janna mid, Soraka mid. A lot of top laners who have in the past gone top and not even laned. There's that meta where Janna top would just go top and roam around the map with the jungler and not even lane. And things like that tend to be somewhat messed up. And so we try to make sure they're not one of the stronger things you could be playing. And so the very last time that we took a swing at Pyke mid, some very relevant stats about the character is he had the highest win rate in mid. He has the highest average gold per game in mid. And he had the lowest CS per game in mid, which was somewhat of a messed up combination of being this character wins a lot, he has more gold than anybody else, and at the same time he is the one who is CSing the least out of anybody. And it was this pattern very much of he'd go to mid, level up a bit, and then spend a lot of time roaming. And we generally just think that's a very dangerous way to have someone be strong in the game. Doesn't mean it wasn't skillful. Doesn't mean it wasn't didn't take a lot of skill. Dave Mon was playing Pyke, right? And he's an incredibly good player, right? I'm not trying to diminish the fact that Pyke mains, especially the higher MMR ones, the things they were doing, a lot of them was wow, that guy's really good at the game, right? But it's just, we didn't really want to support that type of play style being one of the stronger things you could be doing in the mid lane. Pyke mid probably seems a lot more acceptable if one or two things are true. One is if Pyke mid's win rate is closer to Pyke support while still getting play, that character starts looking a lot more acceptable. And the other one is if Pyke mid is more CS reliant and more reliant on farming the wave and not just perma roaming, that starts looking more acceptable, but that just wasn't what the character was doing. So Sorry for the spam, but Seraphine really didn't need to be a support. She was always marketed as a mage, and right now she's stripped from identity. It's kind of sad to see. Yaba, so I'm sorry you feel that way. I totally get where you're coming from. As I've talked about a couple times already today, though, one of the important things you have to think about a champion is where the desire to play them is. And in the case of Seraphine, while it is true that we originally wanted her to be a mid laner, Seraphine very immediately after release was almost overwhelmingly played as a support. Way more than anywhere else. Way more than mid, way more than bot. Seraphine, very quickly after release, overwhelmingly has been played as a support. Support is where her players are. The vast majority of Seraphine players are support players. It doesn't mean she can't be an AP carry. It doesn't mean she can't be a mid. But it does mean that if we are to do right by Seraphine mains, we need to make sure support is a viable part of her identity. Because that is where the vast majority of Seraphine mains are. And that is why we have done all this work on her over the years to move her in that direction, is because the vast majority of people who play her happen to want to play her in support. That's where she's found her audience. And that doesn't mean she can't be a bot laner. Again, I want to separate that out. It doesn't mean she can't be a bot laner, but it does mean that she needs to be balanced in such a way that support can feel powerful. And so she's had a historic problem, just like I was talking about with PYKE, where her bot lane win rate would be very, very high, while being somewhat low play rate, whereas her support win rate would be very low, while being a very high play rate. And so getting those two closer together generally is something that we believe does right by the majority of Seraphine players. So that's kind of the deal there, is, you know, finding the character's audience. Another character like this that you probably don't remember, it's Vi. Did you know that Vi is a really powerful top laner? It's true. Vi's E was designed for top lane. My idea was that she was going to be kind of like Kunkka from Dota, and she'd be able to like EU through the minion wave, and that would be like a big play. Really good gameplay, you know? And so we designed her for top lane, and this is actually her champion spotlight, with Freak narrating, in fact. And very shortly after release, players, even though we marketed her as a top laner and told people, hey, Vi's a top laner, players pretty immediately were like, bro, this is a jungler. And they started playing her there. And in the case of Vi, we could have been like, hey, stop that, she's a top laner. But instead we were like, oh, okay, well, she's found her audience. And her audience happens to be jungle. And so I made a number of changes to her to make sure jungle felt better. And then over time, it turned out jungle was the place we'd have to nerf her for. But yeah, so it's kind of like a similar situation where, yeah, some characters do get marketed in certain positions, certain areas, right? But it's important also that you as a game dev are flexible and kind of recognizing, well, where do they find an audience? Where do their players really like them? And then allow them to go there. So yeah, Vi. Vi stands for not a top laner, apparently. Rip. Sag.